Hi guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. So I'm here today to share with you a really exciting story, and it's the race to Antarctica. Now, there's something incredibly fascinating about exploring the world and going where no one has been before. One thing that I love about history are these stories of human discovery. Now, add to that freezing cold conditions, the Arctic tundra, and we get one of the most interesting, fascinating, and incredible mysterious stories that history has to offer us. The story of Shackleton in Antarctica. Now, this is a story of human endurance, unbelievable conditions, and incredible survival in one of the world's most inhospitable environments. Stay tuned for all the excitement to come. So, Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton was an Anglo-Irish Antarctic explorer. He led 3 British expeditions to the Antarctic, and he's known as one of the heroes of Antarctic, but also British exploration. From 1911, Shackleton made preparations for the Imperial Transatlantic Expedition, which was to leave in 1914. He was to use 2 ships, Endurance, which is behind me, with a team of 6, led by Shackleton himself, and Aurora, which would take a supporting party under the leadership of Captain Mackintosh to lay supply depots across the Great Ice Barrier. So Shackleton's group were going to be the ones that actually did the journey, and Mackintosh's ship was going to sail along the coastline where it's already been explored and leave parcels of food essentially securely in the ice that could be found and then eaten by Shackleton and his group. Now, this was absolutely essential, and it was the food and the fuel that would enable his party, Shackleton's party, to complete the 1,800-mile journey across the continent. Now, in order to fund this expedition, the British government gave Shackleton around £10,000, which is around £900,000 in today's money. Now, Shackleton also used his fundraising skills to bring in private donations. He received £24,000 from Sir James Caird and money from industrialists and even a tobacco heiress called Janet Stancombe Wills. Now, he obviously needs a crew, and he put out this brilliant advertisement in the newspaper that stated men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honour, and recognition in case of success. He received over 5,000 applications from this rather dubious advertisement. And clearly it was something that people were really eager to get involved with. During the interview process, he was also famed for asking some very unconventional questions. He believed character and temperament were as important as technical ability. And for example, when interviewing a man called Reginald James, who's a physicist, he asked him if he could sing. Now, eventually, he selected his crew of 56 men, 28 crewmen for each ship. And despite the fact that World War I broke out in 1914, Churchill directed Endurance to proceed, and on the 8th of August, it left British waters. Now, the crew. So, Shackleton led the expedition, as we know. He was joined by Captain Wolseley, who commanded Endurance, and Lieutenant Stenhouse, who commanded the Aurora. There were 2 surgeons and 70 dogs, and a man called Tom Crean was chief dog handler. There were also biologists, carpenters, and photographers. There was even a cat named Mrs. Chippy, even though it was actually a male cat. Now, the ship set sail, so they were headed for Varsel Bay. However, as they moved southward, ice slowed their progress, and conditions gradually got worse and worse. By the 19th of January, Endurance was frozen in an ice floe. So if you have a look at the map behind me, you can see the journey they tried to take. However, what's happened is they've basically got frozen in the ice. By February, Shackleton realised they'd be trapped until spring, and he ordered the abandonment of the ship and the creation of a winter station. Temperatures in February were minus 20 degrees. The men became frustrated and restless, and they often played football or hockey on the ice to try and keep busy. They hunted for seals for the dogs and themselves to eat, but food was extremely scarce. When the spring weather began to melt, the ice that surrounded the ship, it put huge pressure on the ship's hull. Now, Shackleton had hoped that once free, the ship could then begin her journey again. However, on the 24th of October, water began pouring into the ship. After a few days, Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship, famously shouting, "She's going down!" And the men transferred themselves and their equipment to camps on the ice. Finally, Endurance sank on the 21st of November 1915. So these men are now stranded on an ice floe. They're not even on land, okay? They're literally sat on ice. They have no ship, they have no shelter, and they have no way of getting anywhere or even getting home again. Okay, so that is, imagine that's where they are now. For 2 months even, Shackleton and his party camped on this large ice floe, hoping it would drift towards a place called Paulet Island, which was around 250 miles away, where they knew there were stores of food. After many failed attempts to march across the ice, Shackleton decided to set up a more permanent camp, which they called Patience Camp. By the 17th of March, their camp was within 60 miles of Paulet Island, so it has drifted on this ice floe, having drifted across the ice. But the terrain was impassable and they couldn't make it there. So even though they're now only 60 miles away, they can't walk the bit in the middle. After 5 harrowing, sorry, by the 9th of April, their ice floe broke in two, and Shackleton ordered the crew into lifeboats to head for nearest land. So they've had to desert the ice floe they're sat on. Now, after 5 harrowing days at sea, the exhausted men landed their 3 lifeboats on a place called Elephant Island. And this was 346 miles from where Endurance first sank. It was the first time they had set foot on solid ground for 497 days. That is an extremely long length of time without standing on ground. Shackleton is so worried about his men that he even gives away his own mittens to his photographer, Frank Hurley, which means that Shackleton suffers frostbitten fingers as a result. Now, Elephant Island is an extremely inhospitable place. The only fuel they have is seal blubber to burn for heat, and the men are forced to make a hut out of 2 of the remaining lifeboats. Conditions are extremely cramped. Here is an artistic interpretation of how the men would have had to sleep at night, and food was in very short supply. Many of the sailors already had suffered frostbite, and surgeons were forced to amputate these fingers and toes by the meager light they got from these seal fat stoves. Rescue is highly unlikely as it's extremely far from any of the normal shipping routes. Shackleton therefore makes a choice, and he decides to risk an open boat journey to the 720 miles South Georgia whaling station where he knew he'd be able to get help. Now, they only had these 20-foot lifeboats to sail in, but they chose the strongest one and christened her James Caird after the chief sponsor of the expedition. And the ship's carpenter made some makeshift improvements, for example, a deck of wood and a canvas with which they could kind of hide beneath. He then sealed all of this work with the only thing he had, which was seal blood. So rather than using any normal kind of glue or anything like that, he just had seal blood to work with. Anyway, the James Caird is launched on the 24th of April 1916, and during the next 15 days, it sailed through the waters of the Southern Ocean in constant peril of capsizing. It was traveling around 60 to 70 miles per day, and everything is constantly wet, even their sleeping bags. So at times, they even had to bail out water with buckets and their hands in a race for dear life, racing against the threat of the boat sinking. Now, finally, on the 8th of May, the little boat finally saw the cliffs of South Georgia, but hurricane force winds prevented them from landing. They were forced to ride out the storm in constant danger of being dashed against the rocks. They actually later found out that this very same hurricane had sunk a 500-ton steamer bound for South Georgia. So these 5 men in their tiny little boats had survived the hurricane when a 500-ton steamer had sunk. Now, the next day, after drawing their ship to the coastline, they had a very, very short period of rest and recuperation before realizing they were on the wrong side of the coast, essentially, and they had a huge distance still to cross. Now, Shackleton decided, rather than trying to get back in the boats, that they should attempt a land crossing to reach the whaling station on the northern coast. No one had ever attempted this route before, and this is the mountainous terrain they had to cross. All they had for this journey were the boots they were wearing, which they had stuck homemade screws into to give them some extra grip, and a 50-foot rope. They left 2 of the men behind, and Shackleton travelled with 32 miles with 2 of his men over extremely dangerous terrain, and in 36 hours, they finally reached the whaling station, which looked like this. Now, a British explorer in 1955 called Duncan Carse actually re-travelled Shackleton's route, and he said, "I don't know how they did it, except that they had to." 3 men of the heroic age of exploration. And I think it's so interesting and poignant what he says. You know, they did it because they had to. They had all of their crew left behind on Elephant Island, and they just had to get there. So Shackleton immediately sent a boat to pick up the 3 men he'd left behind, and they set to work trying to organize the rescue of the men left on Elephant Island. His first 3 attempts were foiled by sea ice, which blocked the approach to the island, but the Chilean government offered the use of this boat behind me here, which was a small seagoing tug from their navy called Yelko. And Yelko, alongside a British whaling vessel called Southern Sky, reached Elephant Island on the 30th of August 1916, 4.5 months after the men had first been stranded there. All 22 of the men were evacuated successfully, which is an absolutely incredible feat when you think about it. Sadly, of the men stranded from the Aurora, 3 men had died, including the commander Mackintosh. Now, that is just one story of the incredible exploration, survival, leadership, and bravery of Shackleton's life. He previously had gone to the South Pole, and he ended up later going on a second journey to try to get to Antarctica. But an incredibly inspirational man in terms of British exploration and discovery.